Good afternoon. Gary is out of town at another meeting, so I'll take over until he comes back. And I'd like to have the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
I expected her to say.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We added at our meeting yesterday Citrus Springs Homeowners Association, and I'd like to do that under number 5, public comment. So we'll start off with the regular agenda and then add that if that's suitable.
I'll move to adopt the agenda with that addition.
Second.
If you'd like.
Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Passes unanimously. Thank you. St. John's, Mr. Christensen.
Good afternoon. Robert Christensen with the St. Johns River Water Management District. It's a pleasure to see you again. We appreciate the invitation to come down and talk about a project we're working on. And as that gets queued up on the slides, we've got a series of slides we'd like to go through. This is a relatively complicated transaction I'm sure you've been hearing and reading about. And this is the second of 2 land exchanges which we've been undertaking now for a couple of years to sort of realign the ownership of the Water Management District for the benefit of the Upper St. Johns River project works that we have been undertaking now for some 30 years. So in many respects, this is the last piece of the puzzle on the east side of the river for us to complete our project. So we're actually quite excited about it. This gives me control. Which one do I hit? The roller? Yeah. All right. Again, this transaction involves a proposed land exchange between what we call the Berry Groves Sand Lake Tract and some property interest that the Corrigan family owns. There we go. When we bring this item to our governing board, they'll really be taking 3 actions as part of this transaction. The first is we're recommending that they make a determination that the Sand Lakes Tract is no longer needed for conservation purposes. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but that's a constitutional and statutory test. Secondly, there is a real property exchange, which they will be asked to be acting upon. And third, there's a settlement of a dispute, which is involved in this transaction as well. Madam Chair, I neglected to introduce one of our governing board members who's in the audience, and I wanted to do that at the outset. Bill Kerr. Mr. Kerr is one of our 9 governing board members. He's from Brevard County and serves with distinction as the chairman of our Project and Lands Committee, the committee of the board that oversees land acquisition, management matters, and project matters. So I was real pleased to see Bill here this evening. I'd like to talk about each of those 3 actions that I just mentioned, but just for orientation, you can see in the light blue, and I'll point to the back screen, I think that's probably most convenient for you. In the light blue is the approximately 1,265 acres that the Water Management District refers to as the Sand Lakes Tract. That is the portion of property we're proposing to exchange to the Corrigan family in exchange for an L-shaped piece of property there on the southwest corner of the Corrigan Ranch. I'll show you some better maps in a minute. And an additional flowage easement and hold harmless over everything that the Corrigans own west of I-95. The yellowish colors here are properties owned by the Water Management District, and this up here is the St. Sebastian River State Park, which we have ownership interest within as well. So again, the first issue we look to is the need to retain this property for conservation purposes. In 1998, there were revisions to the Constitution of the state of Florida, one of which created a standard that when entities such as the state and the Water Management District owns conservation lands, that prior to the disposition of those lands, the board of in this case, the governing board of the Water Management District, is required to make a supermajority determination that the land is no longer needed for conservation purposes. So that's a specific constitutional standard. In '99, the Florida legislature codified that provision into Florida statutes, and so that's the standard that we need to meet to dispose of these properties. This issue of the need for conservation purposes, continued need for conservation purposes, is a very difficult public policy issue, relatively recently established, and so we're still in the process, I would say, as a state, of figuring out how to judge this question of are the lands continue to be needed for conservation purposes. Our approach to this issue is to look at these four major categories portrayed on the slide here. First, we look at the intrinsic conservation value of the land itself. What are the conservation resources on the property? Secondly, we look at the regional conservation significance of the property. In other words, the context. How does it fit in? Is it part of a corridor or a connector to other conservation lands, which would render it to be still needed? And then thirdly, we look at the original conservation purpose. Why did we buy the property? Has that changed? Do we still need to retain it for those original purposes? So we look at those three tests, if you will, in our consideration of whether the property is still needed for conservation. And finally, we also look at, as disposition of properties are considered, what's the net conservation benefit? In other words, if we're selling the property, what are we going to do with the proceeds? Or in this case, if we're exchanging the property, what is the conservation result being achieved? And is there a net benefit to the transaction? So those are the four things that we look at. I wanted to go through each one of those briefly with you. As to intrinsic conservation value, we've done a couple things. First of all, we've had the ownership and stewardship of this property since 1999, so we've had a lot of staff working on the property. We've developed a land management plan for the property that our governing board has adopted, done a significant amount of assessments and assays of the property, species observations and so forth, a lot of prescribed burning activities. The property has been under a cattle lease through our ownership of the property. And over time, we've gained quite a bit of knowledge of the property just by being on it and having our scientists out there. In addition to that, we've looked at what information is out there in the scientific literature which would speak to the intrinsic conservation value of this property. There's a couple of maps I want to share with you. What this map shows is a designation for this part of Indian River County portrayed on the map of what are called strategic habitat conservation areas. In the early 90s, the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission undertook a statewide effort, began a statewide effort to figure out what do we need in this state to achieve the conservation results for the state. They looked at some 44 vertebrate species, which they called focal species, and those species, the habitat which supports those species, were evaluated in terms of presence throughout the state. Significant amount of investigation was undertaken to understand what's the minimum habitat requirements to support a sustained population for those focal species, and they went through a mapping exercise and overlaid all the critical habitat for all those focal species, and as you can imagine, they supplemented that with some additional information and have created and updated a map of strategic habitat conservation areas. Now what this map shows is this portion of Indian River County, and what we observe is about 8.5% of the Sand Lakes tract has strategic habitat, according to this map, located right there on the western margin of the property. If I flip back to the aerial photographs, you'd see that's that relatively undisturbed wetland area of shallow marshes and some wet prairie area on the western margin of the property. Again, just for orientation, that's 512 coming down and 60 on the south and 95 running up the eastern boundary of the property. You can see other areas in the county that have strategic habitat, this part of the county, that have strategic habitat areas identified. Now, one of the things about this mapping exercise is they excluded publicly owned property from the analysis, which is why you don't see those large areas of the St. Johns River to the west as strategic habitat. So they said, okay, we're going to assume that the public base is there. What else do we need? That's kind of the somewhat simplistic way to look at it. One of the important things, in addition to the fact that we considered the presence of strategic habitat on this property to be quite low, was we also evaluated those areas to the immediate southwest. And what you can see in the dotted line, those are properties which have been acquired by the district since the original mapping for this occurred. In other words, we have acquired 11 or 1,200 acres in the immediate vicinity of strategic habitat, which in large part serves to accomplish the goal which was set out with this project.
Mr. Christensen?
Yes, sir.
I'm a little bit confused about the criteria of how you selected your habitat conservation areas, and you don't, I don't want you to bore us to details with it, but looking at the northeast corner of 512 and 60, yeah, that corner is Grove.
Yes.
What is strategic about that conservation area?
Well, I don't know. I didn't do this work. I'm reporting to you the results of one of the, this map is one of the standard maps that's looked to statewide for understanding where strategic habitat areas are. I suspect at the time the original mapping for this area was done, that area may not have been Grove.
Okay. Yeah, so do you by chance know the date of this?
The original mapping was the old satellite imagery of it in the late 80s.
That have been about right.
And so, in fact, part of that area is a borrow pit now.
Right, yeah, that's what I mean,
Right.
And there is some wetlands to the north, and I can understand kind of the reservoir perhaps, but knowing that's just Grove, I was wondering how you came up with the criteria to determine what is strategic habitat conservation area.
Importantly, I didn't.
Okay, all right.
And I'm reporting to you what the experts tell us, and probably, okay, I'm going to conjecture here. I haven't even thought about that polygon. But that is right across 512 from that very significant area of wetlands owned by the Water Management District.
East of it. Yeah, east of the Blue Cypress Marsh, or is that what they call it?
Well, this corner is
Right.
part of the
Can't even
district
run.
ownership that's now
Yeah,
flooded.
no airboats, right.
Right. And so one of the issues that's looked at in these types of exercises is contiguity and adjacency. And so to the extent that had wetlands characteristics when the mapping was done, this is all conjecture on my part,
Okay.
it may well have been as an extension to that wading bird habitat deemed to be important.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Chair, Vice Chair, just for clarification, the Berry Farms property, you're saying that based upon just that little blue in the western section, which is wetland area, and you say that's only 8%, is that correct?
Yes.
What,
And
can
then
you,
On this map. I'm gonna
Okay,
show
and
you
then
my
the
map.
blue section just to the east of the Corrigan L property there, is that also wetland?
It's pretty wet, yes.
but it,
Now, there were different species that were targeted for each of these areas. This is not a single species analysis, so it's an overlay of 40 species. I can't tell you, as I sit here, each polygon why it's on the map. I can tell you we've looked at what's on the Sand Lakes piece, and we believe it was driven by the wading bird species.
whenever you give us a percent, for example, the 8%, do you have an acreage figure? Because we're looking at two different.
108.
108?
Yes.
Thank you.
And the age of this map, how current is this map?
I believe it was updated most recently around 2000, but I believe they're still using, obviously, some old original data. And so there's a lag in that. And again, I didn't bring this to you to say this is the best map. We've had a number of people say, wait a minute, this property shows up on everybody's map. Well, we went and looked at the maps, and I'm reporting to you, as I will to our governing board, what's the facts? And the facts are that with respect to strategic habitat conservation areas, this is the result. I've got some more maps I'm going to share with you. Before I do flip, though, another important factor in our view is that this internal rectangular polygon within that larger polygon is an area that's formerly known as the Banjo Groves property locally, and that was a citrus grove up until very recently. We acquired that property in 2003 and have restored it to a wetland character, and the extent to which it replaces the 108 acres for wading bird habitat on the western margin of the Sand Lakes property was another thing we looked at. Basically, our analysis of this mapping suggests to us that we did not find an indication the property was needed for conservation purposes based on this part of the analysis. This is another map product of the same family of analyses prepared by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. And this is a mapping effort that was done not to identify properties that were needed for conservation, but properties that exhibited conservation significance, and they called them biodiversity hotspots. In this case, areas were ranked from low to high priority, with the bottom, the red, being the highest priority, and the colors down towards yellow being the lower priorities. You can see on the Sand Lakes property, again, those same wetlands show up as being biodiversity hotspots. There's other spotty areas in the central and eastern portions of the property that also show up with some conservation significance. Now, those correspond to a large forested wetland creek system that flows north to south through that central eastern portion of the property, and also to some of the pine flatwoods which are in existence on the eastern portion of the property. Just while I've got it up here, you can also see the 460-acre portion of the property has quite a bit of very high habitat value, and we'll come back to that when we talk about net conservation benefit.
Madam Chairman?
Yes.
Mr. Christensen?
Yes, sir.
How was this map created?
This map was created by that same group of scientists that prepared the previous map. And they identified not habitat which was necessary for focal species to continue to subsist, but areas that they felt had conservation value. They had basically they had a land cover map. They had reported information. The red spots, by the way, are where they had specific reported locations, for example, of specific habitat for snail kites. And so where they had an eagle's nest or a specific sighting, they'd put a red dot and put a buffer around it. Where they had relatively high quality habitat, they would rank those habitats in terms of conservation significance, and it's reported here. I've given you a generic description. There's a very thick book that describes how this was done scientifically.
And this data is far more recent?
This was updated, I believe, more recently than the last picture I showed you as well. Again, these are the two sort of standard bearers with respect to the maps people look to when they speak to conservation issues. This isn't the only thing we looked at, but I felt an obligation to present these,
one of the tools,
the ones that are talked about. There's an area I'm not picking up very well, but there's some green in there, which is some relatively low quality hotspots. I want to make sure I've mentioned that to you. That's all that former tomato field area of the property. Quite frankly, I'm not sure why it was on there, but it is in the map. Just for numbers, let's see, I think there's 222 acres of the Sand Lakes tract. There are 222 acres of the Sand Lake tract in that brown category, which is the highest significance, the spotted areas throughout there. And I'll get back to how many there were on the Corrigan piece in a minute. At any rate, we've looked at a lot more maps, but I wanted to give you a flavor of it today, and I'm not going to do any more of those other people's maps on this subject. So as to intrinsic conservation value, our conclusion of the property, based on our own familiarity with the property, our scientists on the property, the various studies which have been completed and presented, is that it has conservation value. We did not consider it to have unique conservation values, which would lead us to the conclusion that it's needed for conservation purposes.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
How many categories of conservation land do you have? Unique and regular? I mean, what are the categories?
I'm using English words. We don't have a classification system. I'm trying to give you a sense of our characterization of the property. This property is very similar to the properties to the north and south. It's from the ridge toward the river. It's very similar to the Anson Ranch, very similar to the Corrigan Ranch in terms of its conservation characteristics, its land cover characteristics. It doesn't have rookeries, it doesn't have nesting habitat for special species and so forth. And so we considered it to be, that's why I use the word average. It has conservation significance. We didn't find that based on the intrinsic conservation values of the property that we believed it was needed to be retained for conservation purposes. There's one other issue, though, I do need to talk about with respect to intrinsic conservation significance. And that is, in the course of our review of the property, we did determine, and here's an aerial photograph more close up of the property, we did determine that approximately 50 acres in red on the northeast corner of the property is scrubby flatwoods, which presents fairly decent habitat for Florida scrub jay, which is a federally listed species. Based on that, in an effort to make sure we knew what was going on, we performed an assay, a survey, to determine if there were any birds on the property. We followed U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protocol, and 5 days or 6 days in a row you go call out these birds, and we have concluded that there are not scrub jays on the property. But we believe that the 50 acres is important. This part of the property is part of what was a number of years ago identified as toward the southern reach of an area which has been identified for the recovery of the scrub jay, which is a very important conservation objective. Based on that, we have concluded that we need to continue to protect this 50 acres of the property. And we are adding to our list of protection that we're accomplishing with this project the retainage of a conservation easement, or a covenant, to protect this 50 acres with an affirmative obligation or responsibility on the part of the district to continue to maintain this 50 acres for the benefit of the scrub jay. There are no scrub jay there, but it may turn out to be an important linkage in the recovery of the scrub jay, depending on what happens to properties, particularly to the north. And so we've carefully evaluated this issue of the importance of the scrub jay habitat, and we are taking measures to not abandon our responsibility with respect to the protection of that species. Now, this determination with respect to scrub jay is a recent, very recent, turn of events in this transaction. Based on that, and I'm going to finish my last slide with a date for the governing board consideration of this, and it's not going to be next week, it's going to be July. Based on this new information with respect to the scrub jay, we felt like we need to do our job to document our findings, to describe what we're doing about it in the context of the determination of conservation need, because we've got a rather extensive assessment which has been prepared but not released on this issue of conservation need, and we feel that it's very important people have time to review that. As you know, in government, probably one of the worst things you can do is rush to judgment and not give people time to understand what you're doing. So we've made a decision just yesterday to extend the date to July for this, and we'll be recommending to our board that they defer this item until the July meeting. I'll put the date up at the end of it. But I wanted to explain to you, first of all, that deferral is occurring, and I wanted you to understand why. It's because we have, in the course of our due diligence, to make sure we're doing a good job with this project, discovered this issue, become more enlightened on this issue of the importance of the scrub jay habitat, and we're taking measures to protect it. That takes time. I'm going to turn now to the regional conservation significance of the property. And I've got one map for you here. Excuse me. Probably the seminal work product which is looked to most to understand corridors and linkages and greenways, you hear a lot of different words for them, is what I'm calling here the Greenways Critical Linkages. It has a long name, but this is a map product which has been prepared under the leadership of scientists at the University of Florida, working with a whole lot of agencies in Tallahassee under the auspices, I believe, of the Greenways group housed in the Department of Environmental Protection. And over the last, I think since '95, this effort has been ongoing and has been most recently updated, I believe, in 2002. I'm not positive of that date. But there's been an effort to understand statewide where are the critical linkages to make sure that we join together these important conservation lands, particularly for large vertebrate species that have large ranges, to make sure that we continue to protect these populations of important species. In particular, there are 10 areas throughout the state which have been identified as the most important linkages, and they are in red. So in this chart, red again is the most important. It happens to be one here, and the other one they have the numbers reversed. But in any event, it's a rank ordered system, red being most important, and the light blue being the low priority areas, and then the intermediate colors in between. So let's look at what we've got. We have a very large area of red on the map. Well, that area corresponds to the district ownerships within the Upper St. Johns River corridor and some properties to the west. And so we're proud that one of the 10 most important corridors in the state is the Upper St. Johns River system. And part of the action, by the way, that we're proposing to do will add to that red area, but I'll talk about that in a second. The Sand Lakes property, and for that matter, the exchange property, the Corrigan Exchange property, are within this bluish designation, and that is a moderately low priority for Greenway's critical linkages. So it has been identified as a moderately low priority linkage. And you'll hear people talk about the importance of the corridor, and so this is why we look to this issue. What's the regional context? What this corridor does is it joins that upper basin, the marshes of the upper reaches of the St. Johns River Basin, and connects it through the Corrigan property, through the Sand Lakes property, through the Anson property, and joins it with the St. Sebastian River State Park, as it's now called. And when we first acquired the Sand Lakes property, we had this corridor in our minds also. This is not new news to us. So it has been reported as an important linkage of a moderately low priority. Well, where does that leave us? It leaves us with the conclusion that there's some conservation significance to that corridor. Is it needed? Well, let's talk about how we reviewed this Greenway's critical linkages issue. We certainly agree and acknowledge and present here that there is a corridor of some significance within which this property is located. Our conclusion is, however, that we don't think that corridor is going to be achieved. And that's a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing to come to grips with. But in this business, sometimes you've got to take a realistic look at what's going to occur. And we have reached the conclusion objectively that we don't think that corridor is going to be achieved as a public conservation corridor. The reasons we think that are there are essentially two properties which would make that corridor happen. To the north, the Anson property, which has been annexed into the city of Fellsmere and is in the midst of a DRI process. We've spoken with the Ansons over the years. Quite frankly, we don't think it's achievable from a public acquisition standpoint. Similarly, with respect to the Corrigan property to the south, we don't believe that that's a viable option from a public acquisition standpoint. First of all, we don't think that it's viable from the willingness of the owners. And secondly, quite frankly, we don't think there's enough money in the various programs, state, district, local, or otherwise, to accomplish that corridor. That's a hard message, but we think it's realistic. Based on that, we have not concluded that this property is necessary for conservation purposes from a regional context, because we don't think that regional context is going to happen. Not a happy message, but it's realistic.
Excuse me, Mr. Richardson, did you consult with the city of Fellsmere on their proposed plans for the Anson annexation and the amount of wetlands that they're going to preserve in that tract?
They'll have to.
Not specifically.
I would suggest you do that, because I think the city has outlined considerable acreage in that parcel that will be preserved as preservation and conservation lands.
Well, and we have thought about that. But in direct answer to your question, we have not. We have spoken with the Ansons on a number of occasions and looked at some of their maps that they're proposing. And there are some considerable protections included in the various development scenarios. We're not led to the conclusion, however, that that accomplishes the conservation corridor significance which was portrayed on this map. And it didn't lead us to the conclusion that we should retain this property to meet that need. Part of what we did think about was what is the ultimate fate of the Sand Lakes tract and the rest of the properties to the south. And none of us has a crystal ball that works, but I wouldn't be surprised if similar protections wind up on those properties as well. That's not our fallback or our safety net, but that's part of what we thought about, and it's a fair issue. Moving on to the next issue, original conservation purpose. And Madam Chair, I hope I'm not taking too long, but I wanted to walk through this carefully with you all. Original conservation purpose was the third of the sort of the three-part test for us. Portrayed on this figure is the Sand Lakes property, the adjacent remaining portion of the Berry Groves property, and that is what we originally bought in 1999 as a package. We bought, I bet I could zap that guy, couldn't I? We bought this property outlined in orange in 1999 from the Berry Groves Corporation. And why did we buy it? Well, this part of the property, which used to be Orange Grove, and I've talked to you about this before in our other exchange, but we originally bought this piece to put a reservoir there. And this is the extreme southeast corner of the Fellsmere Drainage and Water Control District, and that's a lot of agricultural land. One of the programs that we've undertaken, not only in this part of our district, but also in the Putnam County area, in the Lake Apopka area, Lake and Orange County, and elsewhere, is working with agricultural producers to accomplish water supply objectives, water quality objectives, for those agricultural operations. And we purchased this property to build a reservoir, 1999. We began our engineering work, and I've described this to you before, and we came to the conclusion that there was a better location to put a reservoir within the Fellsmere Drainage and Water Control District. So in 2002, we bought this 4,000 acres, which, by the way, that's the stick marsh there in Blue Cypress Lake out to the west. We bought this 4,000 acres in 2002 as a preferred location for our reservoir. And then finally this year, earlier in 2007, we expanded the ownership to include this additional 6,000 acres so that this will be a 10,000 acre area we call the Fellsmere Water Management Area. And as I believe you know, to get this 6,000 acres expansion to our reservoir project, we exchanged this 2,100 acre or so portion of the original Berry Groves property. So if you go back to the original memoranda with our governing board of why did we buy this property in 1999, we bought it to build a reservoir. When we bought this part of the Berry Groves property, the Berry Groves retained this grove to the west of what we bought. And the basic transaction went as follows. We're interested in buying this property for a reservoir. So we'd like to get this 2,100 acres or so. And the response was, well, we'd be willing to sell it, but we don't want to be left with this piece out here, all or none. And we said, well, it has some conservation value, so we'll see if we can work that out. The expense, the cost of that Sand Lakes tract at the time, if I remember correctly, was $1,300, $1,350 an acre. Given the overall cost of the deal, we felt like that was a reasonable result to bring in, again, our goal being to build the reservoir. And so that's why we bought the property. I don't want to leave you with the impression that we didn't have any conservation objective for the Sand Lakes property. We did, but it wasn't what was driving the transaction. So we reached a conclusion about 3 or 4 years ago, 3 years ago, let's say, that the Berry Groves property overall was surplus to our needs, what we're trying to accomplish down here in the county, and we began to look for the opportunities, which the second of which is what we're presenting to our board in July, this transaction we're talking about today. When we first submitted the comprehensive land use plan change, which we've all had a fair amount of history with, both or all of this Berry Groves property was included in that proposal. There was no secret. There was no, it was a full disclosure, and we've talked in public meetings for several years now that it's been our intention to exchange the Sand Lakes property with the Corrigans as part of our disposition of this overall Berry Groves original purchase. So our assessment of the criterion of do we still need the property for the original purposes for which we acquired it, we think not. And so we don't believe that it's necessary to retain a property for that conservation purpose. So on those 3 points, as I'm kind of repeating myself, we don't believe that it's needed for conservation purposes. Remember, the 4th category was net conservation benefit. Let me just touch on that real quickly. At the sort of the chainsaw cutting butter level, the grossest level, on the Sand Lakes tract, I presented to you there's 108 acres of strategic habitat conservation areas. On the Corrigan tract, there's 237. On the biodiversity hotspots, the top category with 6 or greater species supported, there are 222 acres on the Sand Lakes, 406 on the Corrigan. That's a snapshot of how we view the net conservation benefit. But probably much more importantly, is what we're able to achieve with the acquisition of the flowage easement and hold harmless agreement that we are obtaining over 7,171 acres of the Corrigan property, which is everything they own west of I-95. Acquisition of that flowage easement, hold harmless agreement, gives us the ability to operate the Upper Basin Project, specifically the Blue Cypress Water Management Area, which houses an extremely significant population of snail kites. And I'll talk in a minute about the snail kite benefits to the Blue Cypress Water Management Area. But when you really talk about net conservation benefit, that's the home run of this thing.
Real quick, Mr. Christian, the hold harmless area that you've delineated there, it's basically west of 95. But looking at it, it does not include the new, or the Sand Lake area.
Well, and if that map doesn't show it, that's an error. It does include, it will include the 1,265 acres. Okay. And the last map, I think, that you'll see does show that, I think. I know one of them does. Okay. But it is included in that 7,171 acres. Yeah, it would have been difficult to have gone through this transaction and then wound up with some conflict on the 1,265 acres. We figured that out somewhere along the way. So with respect to the need to retain this property for conservation purposes, we don't believe it's necessary to retain it for conservation purposes, and that's the first issue our board will respond to. The next issue is the actual exchange itself. And this map also doesn't show it because the black and white have got too many lines going. But again, essentially, District of Corrigan will be the 1,265-acre Sand Lakes property with the 50-acre conservation easement for the scrub jay retained. 460 acres Corrigan to District in that southwest corner, and an additional flowage easement and hold harmless over 7,171 acres. Let me give you the math on how all that works. This is a valuation summary, and we had a fairly spirited discussion in this room the last time I was here with the Land Acquisition Advisory Council on these issues. And to be honest with you, I didn't come in the door really prepared for that discussion, but I am today. On the left is what we're giving up in this exchange, and on the right is what we're getting. I have not updated this table for the conservation easement, but that'll be a value for value transaction on the bottom of this, so it won't affect the net. Again, let me go back a step. We had an appraisal done of the Sand Lakes property and the western two-thirds of the Corrigan Ranch. Appraisal was completed in December 2005. We can get into the timing of it and the fact that there were one and so forth, but we followed appropriate procedures with respect to appraisals. The underlying value of the Sand Lakes tract was just short of $7,000 an acre. The overall value opined for the western two-thirds of the Corrigan tract was at $17,000 an acre. The differences in those numbers, a number of people scoffed at, has to do, I went back and talked to the appraiser about this at some length. It has to do primarily with two issues, access and wetlands. So those shouldn't surprise any of us. The access to State Route 60, legal access to the Corrigan tract, was hands and above far superior to the access to the Sand Lakes tract. The access to the Sand Lakes tract is through a fairly circuitous route coming down south from the downtown area of Fellsmere directly south onto a unpaved road, and then turning 90 degrees onto another unpaved road, and then crossing a canal onto a levee, and then down a levee and across another canal onto a levee. So
We do that kind of stuff in our grove all the time.
I was going to say, you just got to my house.
from the standpoint of the appraiser's perspective,
Comparative.
I live on a dirt road myself, so. But from the standpoint of the appraisals, that was an important significance to the appraiser when he reached his conclusion of highest and best use and what comparables to use.
Okay, let's turn that off, please. Thank you.
So at any rate, those were the values which were opined. On the left then, the 1,265 acres at $6,951 an acre carries a value of just under $9 million, and there's a cash contribution towards the land component of this of some $438,000. So what we're giving up for the land portion is $9.25 million, just short of that. On the right-hand side, Corrigan to St. John's, the 460 acres. Now remember, here we get into another sort of appraisal issue. In evaluating the value of a piece of land to be severed from a parent, is the phrases appraisers use, you look at the value of the parent tract, and most typically, the value will be equivalent to the per acre value of the parent. That's the most typical way. If we followed that approach, we'd pay $17,000. We would consider the 460 acres to have $17,000 an acre in value. Quite frankly, we don't think it does. But that would be a fairly typical result of an appraisal. What we do think is that the 460 acres is quite similar in character to the western portion of the Sand Lakes property, which carries a value of $7,000 an acre. And so what we're discussing with our board as a sort of the reasonable test with respect to the value for value is let's assign a value to the 460 of $7,000 an acre for purposes of evaluation under the theory that it's most similar to the western portion of the Sand Lakes tract. And that is the number there, $3.2 million. We're also obtaining a 20-acre flowage easement along the southern margin of that 460, which is important, very important to us. It's a separate real estate interest, though, so we value it differently, and we put it at 90% of the value of the $7,000, and so it carries a total of $126,000. And certainly, most importantly, what's the value of the flowage easement hold harmless? Difficult question. Again, tough appraisal issue. 7,171 acres is the land area over which this easement will be conveyed. And typically, in easement valuations, you look at what percent of value is represented by that easement right. If you're in a power line business, you might be looking at 60 to 90% of value. If you're in the water business for a full-blown flowage easement that you can stack water upon, you're looking at 90% of value. If you're in the mineral rights business, you might be down at 5 or 10% of value. So you get a wide variation of percent of value. What we have assigned for purposes of evaluation on this easement is 5% of the underlying value is what we are opining to be the value of the easement. You do the math, that's $850 an acre over 71 acres, which equals just over $6 million. Add them up, and we're getting $9.4 million. We're giving up $9.23 or whatever those numbers are. So that's the math that is the basis for our recommendation to our board that they consider this exchange to be a value for value exchange.
Can you explain to me one more time the flowage easement? Mm-hmm. Thank you. Just in practical terms, I mean, what
yeah, I think I can do that. The flowage easement, and I'll show you a picture in a minute, but we own all the property on the boundary.
On the west side.
On the west side. The flowage easement gives us the right to flow water onto the Corrigan property.
At any time?
To the east.
Finished.
Okay.
To the east. It also gives the Corrigans the right to build a blockade to stop the water. That's why it's not 90%, that's why it's 5%. It gives them the right to do that, the obligation to maintain it. There's no obligation on the district to do anything other than operate our project.
Okay. So,
and similarly, if for any reason water gets over, under, through, around, from the district onto the 71 acres, the district is held harmless. That's why we call it a hold harmless from any claims by the landowners, and this currently the Corrigans, but it runs with the land. So that's what it is.
I'm assuming that would be the case unless you decided to put a levee or a structure to restrict the water flow of the natural flow of the St. Johns North.
The backstop is we've got a project that's several, it's 120,000 acres or whatever. It's got a federally authorized
sheet flow.
It has a federally authorized schedule, and we have to do that. I mean, we're bound to that anyway. So that's the backstop for the easement. If we change that and somehow raise the water levels, yeah, all bets are off.
Okay, all right.
But we're not going to change it.
Okay.
Today you're not going to change it. Anything's possible.
But it would let
We've had that
go out of it.
discussion.
Mr. Christian, I had a question on the appraisals. You mentioned a little bit that the big difference was two issues. One was access to the properties, and then you briefly mentioned that the percent wetland coverage also, in fact, impacted the appraisals. When you and I met in my office on May 21st, we went into great detail and discussed this, and you told me that one of the reasons why the Sand Lake parcel was appraised lower was, one, the lack of access, but you also said because your appraiser said it was 50% wet.
I think it was about 52, if I remember.
Okay. Well, just earlier today, you showed us the conservation value map that showed only 8% was wetland area.
Well,
so how do we go from your map that you used to justify that it's not conservation area, which only showed 8%, and then you show us this appraisal, it's got a lowball figure because it's 52% wet. There's a big disconnect there in how you're looking at this.
All right. Well, I apologize if I gave you the impression that there were only 8.5% wetlands on the property. What I said was there's 8.5% of the property that is included as strategic habitat conservation area by the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Those are two different things.
Well, you also said that was wetland area, because I asked you again to clarify the 8%.
Well, I misunderstood you. I apologize for that. What I said, I thought, was that the 8.5% corresponds approximately to that westernmost portion of the property with relatively undisturbed wetlands along that western margin. There are significant wetland areas elsewhere on the property. We've acknowledged that those wetlands exist, and I said there are conservation values to the property. So I apologize for the disconnect, but it was not intentional.
Well, okay. I guess, again, then, you have just said there's significant wetland areas. Why are those not strategic for conservation, then? I mean...
Well, why they're not strategic habitat conservation areas, I can't answer that. I didn't do that map. They have conservation significance. Is it necessary to own them for conservation purposes? That's the question we're tasked with answering. And we have concluded that it's not necessary to own those wetlands for conservation purposes.
Okay. I guess my other question is, too, you all have had the Blue Cypress Water Management Area in effect for how long? 15 years now? Or?
Put a map up and describe that?
Well, I guess my question is, you've been managing that now for quite a few years for snail kite habitat and such, and I don't believe you've ever flooded the Sand Lake property. You probably have not flooded all the way to 95. So why did the district feel you needed to get a flowage easement over the full 7,000 acres and not just, say, the very western portions of the Corrigan property where you might be able to make the inference that there's some seepage? I mean, I don't see you seeping all the way up to the Sand Lake property, so why do you feel the need you have to have a flowage easement over that?
Let me put a map up. I want to respond to that. It's a good question. And that leads me right to my last fourth bullet that I put up in the beginning, which is this is a settlement of a dispute. I'll go back to this map that was up here earlier and give some geographic context, and I'll answer your question specifically. The 460 acres is this corner of the Corrigan Ranch being everything in black, approximately 9,000 acres. In the yellow color, this is the southeastern corner of the upper St. Johns River Basin ownership and project area. There's lots of levees and water control structures and so forth, but the area, this region here, is managed as the Blue Cypress Water Management Area. As of 1998, we owned to this line here. In 1999, we acquired this northeastern portion of the Blue Cypress Water Management Area, and we did begin to operate our project at the around 1998-99 timetable. When the project was designed, I've had the question, well, why didn't you buy this 460 then, right?
And the dike was existing at the time, is that correct? I think you told me it was built back in the 20s.
This levee, I don't know when it was built, but it's been there for a long time, before I think any of us. That's getting easier to say each year, by the way.
Speak for yourself.
At any rate, when this project was originally designed, the water level schedule was such that it was the engineering conclusion that we were not raising water levels above that which was originally existed in this part of the river system. And that's how we started. And we did start, and we flooded it. And in one respect, we were thrilled. In another, we were, surprised when the snail kites arrived. That was formerly called, I think, an Everglades snail kite, now the snail kite. And snail kites took up residence through significant portions of this, and it became a very important refuge for the snail kite, particularly when the Everglades dried up, when there was water here, and it became a very important alternative site. We entered into an agreement with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Remember, this is a federal project. This whole St. John's project is a federal project, which, with all the environmental laws in existence, requires consultations and all sorts of things. Among them is a consultation to protect the snail kite. So we entered into an agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service to change the water level management in this system somewhat higher and not draw it down so that the snail kites would be protected. That was in the early 90s. I don't have the exact date. So as of that point, we didn't own this corner here, and we didn't own that, all of which was waterward of the Corrigan levee. And, you know, water rises and water falls, and seasons come and go, and over time we began to get some feedback from the neighbors that they were concerned about the water levels in this area. And I think we came to grips with it probably in around 99, 2000 timetable, and said we really need to make sure we have the land ownership necessary for us to do our job. Subsequent to that, in 2003, finally we closed on these three or four ownerships in this corner of the project area. There were a number of disputes ongoing at that time frame between landowners in the district. This was a real hotbed of activity back in that time period. And for the most part, everybody pretty well settled up. And this settlement that we're talking about today is the last settlement of matters. At any rate, the bottom line is then that we now own all that, and this 460 is clearly open hydrologically to the district's ownership and experiences water levels the same as those which we manage for the snail kite. And that puts us in the posture of having issues. That's the dispute. In addition to that, there are representations and claims and concerns by the Corrigans about seepage through the levee onto their properties to the east. The levees leak. Is there seepage through a levee? Never seen one that didn't have seepage. How much? It's a good question. It's a good legal question. It's a good engineering question. We've chosen to enter into settlement discussions to not go down that road. We think that that's a better course. To your question, why did we go to the highway all the way to I-95? Historical records suggest that the St. Johns River has actually surpassed the 10-mile ridge and spilled into the Indian River Lagoon historically. It may again. When and if that happens, we're protected. That's the short answer.
Wouldn't that be an act of God if that were to happen, though, and you're protecting yourself from a 100-year rain event or something? How could that be the district's responsibility?
The court may conclude that. We'd just soon not go find out. So it was in an abundance of precaution, and that was the basis for that determination. Madam Vice Chair, I'm done. I'm sorry it took so long.
No, that's fine.
But I felt it was, from our standpoint, important to get our message out, and we really appreciate your inviting us down and your attention, and we're very much interested to respond to any questions you may have. I understand you have other speakers, so we'll...
Any questions right now? Or we have 3 other speakers.
Yeah, I would like to express my appreciation for Mr. Christensen coming down again. I've met with him several times. I think we've had very good, frank discussions. I think we probably agree. We may disagree on some aspects of this, but that's okay. But I do appreciate you coming down, and we do, I think, speak for all of us. We appreciate St. John's and Mr. Kerr coming down, and hopefully we'll kind of get all this hammered out and worked out.
Thank you.
And if you'll just hold on, we have another couple speakers, and we might have some questions at the end, please. Next speaker is Charles Lee from the Audubon.
Madam Chairman, members of the Commission, Charles Lee, Director of Advocacy of Audubon of Florida. If I might, if we can have the lights down at some point in this presentation, I'd like to be able to refer to some of the maps that Mr. Christensen did and back up to cover a couple of them. I'm not sure how to back this thing up, but I might... The wheel, okay. I'd like to begin by saying that the reason I'm here today is because we as the state Audubon organization have been alerted to this case. We were alerted by the Pelican Island Audubon Society, one of our longtime chapters in the state. And as we begin to sort of peel back the issues associated with this proposed land exchange, we became more and more concerned about the fact that this was one of the cutting-edge proposals to actually surplus or get rid of land that had been acquired under the conservation programs since the constitutional amendment in 1998 that established some very clear criteria for the surplusing of land that was designed to, frankly, severely limit the surplusing of land to only those cases that there was a clear indication that land was no longer needed for conservation purposes. Frankly, as we reviewed more of this case, we realized what was happening here. And what was happening here was we had a state agency, the Water Management District, that was being, I would say, pursued fairly rigorously or vigorously by attorneys for a particular landowner, the Corrigan interests, and that there had been serious threats of litigation levied at the district for a period of time. The district, frankly, was running scared ahead of those threats of litigation. It was looking for an easy way out. And the easy way out was to enter into the land deal with the Corrigans that you see being proposed in these slides. We're concerned that if we back into determinations that conservation lands are no longer needed for conservation on the basis of other motivations, that we get on a very slippery slope statewide. And I think that if I can do this right, I will go back through the slides and show you one of the points that I want to make about this. This is it. Mr. Christensen showed you several slides that attempted to use different GIS layers to indicate conservation value of land. Now, I'd invite you to look at this one. You see, this is the area he characterized as being moderately low-value lands under this Greenway's critical linkages. And that was one of the reasons he said that he was comfortable in reaching this determination that the lands were no longer needed for conservation purposes. Now, note the location of those, quote, low-value lands on this map. And now I'm going to try to wheel back through and show you this map. This is the San Sebastian River Preserve, which was also acquired as conservation lands. And note, it lies in those same moderate to low value lands. If the logic Mr. Christensen gave you today holds, if it's valid, that it's appropriate to surplus this parcel of land using the indicator that he utilized, namely the critical conservation linkages, which show that this entire area is only of low value, then I would suggest to you that 5 years from now or 10 years from now, driven by other factors, driven by another landowner threatening another lawsuit, driven by politics, driven by the desire to develop land, driven by a proposal for some perhaps public facility, maybe a prison, maybe a school, a university campus, an airport, who knows what will happen in the future. That the logic that Mr. Christensen exhibited to you today would just as easily support the surplusing of that land as it did this land, because when you look at the indicator he used, it was the same, quote, low value for that area. What you actually have to do in order to use these GIS layers in a valid analysis is you have to put them all together. You can't parse them out the way he did in his presentation. When you parse them out, it's possible to argue that bits and pieces of the area are of lower value than they really are. I think what you have to do is you actually have to go back to the analysis that was given when this parcel was acquired and ask the question, has anything about the environment changed? We don't believe anything about the environment has changed. Now, admittedly, as Mr. Christensen pointed out, there was an intent by the district at the time this was acquired to use part of it for a reservoir. And unlike the land acquisitions that happened in the bulk of the reservoir areas of the Upper St. John's project, which used what we would call project funds to acquire those lands for reservoirs, in this case, the district managed to cobble together a deal that used a different group of funds, the conservation lands funds under Florida Forever, to buy these lands. Now, going back and analyzing that decision, frankly, it may have been an improper decision by the Water Management District. It may have been a decision which was outside of the legitimate purpose for the acquisition of these lands if what they were going to do was later to flip it over and use it for a reservoir or attempt to exchange the lands. But the reality is they did an analysis under the requirements to buy lands with the conservation funds, and they found that this entire tract, including the 1,200 acres they want to trade away today, had conservation value. They can't have it both ways. And we think that given the fact that this tract was acquired with an analysis that showed it had conservation value, unless those specific values have gone away, the district under the Constitution of the state, the district under the statute of the state, is not entitled to simply trade this land away because it's running scared in front of a lawsuit. A lawsuit which might or might not be filed, a lawsuit which might or might not be won. Our view is that the district had ought to do several things. One, the district had ought to proceed to budget the funds to buy that 460 acres. We think it's obviously connected to the St. John's project. We don't think it's necessary to give this away in order to do that. The second thing that we think the district needs to do is to recognize that at the time the Upper St. John's project was designed, there were engineering studies. The district's experts, the Corps of Engineers experts, all concluded that this levee would be adequate to protect against flooding that would be caused by the water level changes in the Blue Cypress Reservoir at the time this project was designed. If in fact there is a lawsuit that is successful, if in fact a judge, a jury awards compensation to the Corrigans for any alleged flooding, which we think frankly is speculative, then the time to consider how to pay that judgment will happen at that time. We don't have to put the cart before the horse and assume that a lawsuit victory is going to be won when it may not in fact be won. At the time, if that victory were won, the district should go to the tax base of the 18 counties in the district. Since this is a project that is of district-wide significance, we think that it ought not to be taken out of particular pieces of conservation land to settle it. It ought to be settled looking at the entire project purpose of the district. And the second thing the district could obviously do at that juncture, which we think is pretty speculative, is to go to the legislature and ask for funding to pay the judgment at the time. The problem is, if we get into a posture where the district is on a footing where the first place they run when they get a lawsuit threat and they want to settle a lawsuit by making a monetary payment or a land exchange is to look to our conservation lands for the remedy, we have a serious problem with conservation lands in the state. Now, finally, I'd like to point out that, I think it's interesting, the slides that we've seen today with the picture of the scrub jay area, which the district has just now discovered, and I think I'm glad that they've discovered that. I'm glad they're including it in their calculus. But the thing you need to remember is on the 8th of May, this item was on the governing board agenda of the St. John's River Water Management District for a final decision. And on the 8th of May, the Audubon Society and other organizations went there to enlighten the governing board of the district of the serious nature of this matter. The fact that they have discovered this scrub jay area after the item was postponed on that May 8th agenda is very telling as to what is going on here. Because what's happening is, again, the district running scared ahead of the threat of this lawsuit is trying to build and develop a rationale after the fact as to why it should be able under the Constitution to trade off these lands. Again, that gets us to the very concerning slippery slope. If, in fact, any of the conservation lands that we might have in this corridor are going to be subject to a later determination that we don't need them and we can trade them away, I would suggest to you that a lot more than just the 1,200-acre parcel that is at stake in this exchange is at risk in terms of conservation lands in Indian River County, Brevard County, and this area. We think the district ought to be turned away from the slippery slope. And we would suggest that there are ways that can happen. You, as the county commission for this county, could pass a resolution. You could direct that resolution both to the governing board of the St. John's River Water Management District. You could direct it to the legislative delegation. You could direct it to Governor Christ and the cabinet of the state of Florida. And you could ask that the St. John's River Water Management District be instructed, encouraged, otherwise persuaded not to follow this course of action and to hold these conservation lands harmless from the threat of the lawsuit that is out there. Generally, we agree with most of the things that the St. Johns River Water Management District does. I've had the pleasure of being at a podium supporting Mr. Christensen in proposals to acquire lands all over the state on many, many occasions, and I really prefer to be on that side of the aisle with him rather than opposing him. But I think he's made the wrong choices here. I think the district's made the wrong choices here, and I think that with regard to conservation lands, as on behalf of our statewide organization, that this needs to be nipped in the bud as early as possible, and we would hope that you would join us in doing so.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very
Lee.
much.
Dr. Richard Baker.
I'm just waiting for the computer to fire up. Is it there? All right, thank you. We may be old-fashioned here in Indian River County, but we do like St. John's. They've done a terrific job for us here in the past. And I share Charles Lee's thought that we like being with them instead of against them, and it doesn't happen very often. But in this case, I think we are concerned. How does this go? The wheel? Maybe I need 101 instruction here. There it goes. Oh, sorry. Yes. What we like about the St. John Water Management District, they've done a terrific job in the Upper Basin project. And these are some slides from Blue Cypress Lake, and many of us enjoy going out there. It's a great place to catch fish. And as the next slide, sorry. This shows the general map of the county, the future land use map, and you can see that St. John's owns practically all the land around the Blue Cypress Lake. And this is a little outdated because part of that T, and you've seen a lot of maps today, part of the top part of the T has been eliminated or been purchased or traded away, and unfortunately the county has maintained to keep it a conservation designation. Next slide, please. And we kind of covered over the cost and the appraisal value of this land. The $7,000 an acre just doesn't seem very appropriate here for the 1,200 acres. And when you compare, now he's added an easement, a flowage easement, but it looks like the flowage easement won't be there in perpetuality, that, you know, Corrigans will be able to put up a wall or something to stop that, and when they do, then you don't really have your flowage easement anymore. So the benefits are more or less with this degree, with this scenario that Mr. Christensen has presented earlier, was that the Corrigans get about $1 million out of this, plus they were sweetening it up a little bit by $657,000. And earlier, Peter O'Brien stated at the land acquisition meeting that he would certainly pay the Corrigans $1 million if he could buy the land for $7,000 an acre. If you switch that, and I would think that the land would be considered, if you take $10,000 from one of the area and move it over to the other, and so that the Corrigan land was actually worth $7,000 an acre, and the land that the district is thinking of trading is worth $17,000 an acre. You'll see that the Corrigans will benefit by about $18 million in that deal. And I would think that might be more appropriate, that you would have this higher land would be worth more. Mr. Christensen said that the appraisers figured out it was difficult to get down those dirt roads to it, and that's why there's a $10,000 difference in acreage. Next slide, please. If, though, as Mr. Corrigan presented here, when we were discussing about changing at an earlier workshop, or it was a county commission meeting, Mr. Corrigan stated that he had been offered $20,000 an acre for his ranch, and he decided not to sell. So if you take that $20,000 an acre and multiply it times both the 1,200 acres and the 640 acres, you see you get $25 million for the district's land, $9 million for the Corrigan land, and still the Corrigans are making a profit of $16 million. Next slide, please. This, you saw some maps on wildlife. This is one of them out here. And if you look at the part, does this have a pointer in it? If you look the area in question here, you see that it is, it actually has a very high wildlife value. And this map was presented by the U.S. or the state's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So why are we paying more to receive less? Next slide, please. This is a bad deal, and Charles has gone into detail, and I'll go over this just very quickly, is that it was purchased for conservation purposes. Why? Is that it was valuable then for conservation. It's just as valuable now as it was then. Next slide. In summary, we suggest that solutions to the problem, we'd like to let the courts decide this issue if there is a problem. If the courts decide against the district, then let the district find other means to pay off the judgment. And that St. John should not sell the conservation lands. Next slide, please. You can see if the deal goes through here, and you have the Anson property right here, and this then becomes private property here, it's pretty easy to think that Fellsmere can sort of head down south to Route 60 and onto the St. Lucie border. Next slide. This is a slide that Mr. Keating gave me, and you've actually seen this before, and I'm just presenting it to refresh your memory. Next slide. This shows some recent annexations that the city of Fellsmere has done, where it's kind of hard to read, but where it was about 4,000 acres of the Anson property, basically, and some additional others, where they now with Fellsmere's annexation, the density of this area could be 27,000 people. Next slide. This is, I believe, the next annexation, and I think Fellsmere Joint Venture has paid the city of Fellsmere $1 million to annex this, and I believe the decision of this is going to be made this week or next week. And you can see where the 1,265 acres are, a really key piece in this puzzle. Next slide. And Mr. Keating put this as future annexations by the city of Fellsmere. Next slide. If you add all that together, Fellsmere could hold 231,000 people, which would be about 100,000 more than we currently got in our county. Next slide. Now, the last annexation that took place by a city, I believe, was Sebastian. And I go by this, and Commissioner Davis goes by this probably every day. This was, in fact, a few Sebastian city councilmen probably lost their jobs over this one. This is some of the land right along the Sebastian River was purchased. It was in the county, and it was annexed by the city about a little over 3 years ago, before any of you were elected, but just before you were elected. And then they sold off some to KB Homes. And so the next slide will show this wonderful development that we have here. This is right along, I took this slide out my window going along 512. Next slide shows it's one of the new towns that we have. It's got a shopping area, Publix to the right. They're building a four-laning 512. There are a bunch of little shops over there, and the people from KB Homes can go into the Publix in the back way. They have a sort of a private way to get back in there. Next slide. So how does this relate to the wonderful job that St. John's has done in the Upper Basin project? Really a super project, and really an example of what they should be doing in the Everglades. I mean, I really take my hats off to St. John's, because they did a terrific job there with a lot less money, and it really set the model. But what's going to happen if we have too many people and we get this all developed? Next slide. I was out to Blue Cypress about 6 weeks ago, and where you saw those trees in that earlier photograph, the people were in my canoe, were standing by a tree, and actually, if under normal water conditions, the level would be up to about your waist. The next slide. And I was out a couple weeks ago, and the water level in St. John, or in the Blue Cypress Lake, has gone down even further. This is one of my favorite trees out there. Next slide. So this is the way the Blue Cypress Lake looks today around the edge of it. You have to go out quite a ways to get to the water. Now this is a natural drought, but if we're going to be filling up all these homes, 230,000 homes out there around the St. John's area, St. John's Marsh, where are they going to get their water? Next slide. So this is the way it looked about 2 weeks ago. Before, you saw that big tree there that was way out in the lake. Now it's not there. It's on the shore, and you have to go further out. Next slide. So the Upper Basin project is really a super project. But next slide. But I don't believe that St. John should protect its or ours, and I think ours is a good question, because who does this land that they're trading belong to? Does it belong to St. John's? Does it belong to the state of Florida? Does it belong to us who are taxpayers? We pay money into St. John's? Who does the land belong to? St. John's should protect its precious conservation land and not give in to the Corrigans. At least the district is at the mercy of every landowner who calls for a lawsuit. Thank you.
Thank you. We have to stop in just a few minutes, but I want to try to get in for a break, but want to try to get in Dr. David Cox now.
Mindful of the break that's about to come, thank you, Commissioner Bowden. I will be as brief as I can be. Thank you, Mr. Christensen, for coming down here. I don't envy you your job today. And as Mr. Lee and Mr. Baker said, Dr. Baker said, we far prefer being on the same side of the table with the Water Management District rather than being on the opposite side, and we hope that we'll get there again. I wanted to, if you could go to the linkages map, I wanted to address one particular item and then return to something that Charles Lee mentioned earlier. It's not my job to put Mr. Christensen on the spot about particular coverages and GIS maps, and many of these are products that are used for particular kinds of tasks, and we use them for other things as well, and they're not always ideally suited to the task at hand. Actually, I meant for Mr. Christensen's linkage map, but sorry. Thank you, Rand. The specifics of the maps, as I think Mr. Lee intimated, really the maps don't work well in isolation from one another, and the best use of them is combining multiple kinds of data sets to triangulate on properties that have the highest value. And the Greenways maps were prepared I believe by the University of Florida Geoplan Center, Dr. Tom Hochter, and these date from 2002 to 2004. The Governor's Century Commission is currently working on a new project that's the Conservation Lands and Waters Identification Project, and the same people at the Geoplan Center are doing brand new maps that show statewide critical conservation land patterns, linkages between core areas and connectors, and basically the same pattern holds in Indian River County with the parcels in question being identified. As Mr. Lee pointed out, the old St. Sebastian River Buffer Preserve, now the St. Sebastian River State Park, on the basis of the priorities assigned in this map, never would have been purchased, presumably, since it has relative only moderately low priority under this critical linkage map. Now, I would just like to make an observation. Somehow those priorities were established. And at the statewide level, the way that they were established is that they value more highly north-south linkages than they do east-west linkages. So higher priority is assigned to corridors that run north-south. And that's just, if you peel it back, you start asking questions, well, how were the priorities in these assigned? And I think we've heard from Mr. Christensen that, the land does have conservation value. It's recognized. And people will go one way or another to how valuable that is. And I think that I would imagine that if we could visit the lands with St. Johns River Water Management District regulatory biologists, they might have a different view of the conservation value of that land. If you were trying to develop that land, they would probably have a very different assessment of the conservation value of the resources on that land. So there are different parts of the Water Management District may view these things differently, even internally. And I want to bring you back to the slippery slope. The surplusing of state lands, of our public trust, lands that are held for us by the state, the surplusing of these lands at a statewide level, other water management districts are also engaging in these activities. And this is a matter of serious concern, especially in a county where 30% of the land area of our county is held by a water management district. And I'm not proposing that St. John's is going to surplus the Upper Basin project. That's clearly preposterous. But other state agencies, like DEP that owns our parks. Presumably they have surplusing procedures as well. This is a matter for all of the public, I believe, to be keenly aware of and concerned about. And I think that the conservation value of this parcel is still present and accounted for. The Water Management District was correct in buying this land, and it is appropriately designated as conservation land right now. And I think that the surplusing of this land for the purpose of settling a potential lawsuit is not sound public policy. That's my opinion. And I thank you very much for your time and would encourage you to take up Mr. Lee's recommendation and to move forward with a statement to the governing board, perhaps to Governor Christ, stating what the county's position is. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. We have to take a 10-minute break for captioning, and then we'll come back with final questions and any wrap-up on this portion.
Very well done, Madam Vice Chair.
Gee.
Well, now, what do you got? One or, you know?
Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Your Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment. Indian River County Commission meeting is in a brief recess. Please stay tuned. The meeting will reconvene in just a moment.
If we can bring the and we'd be delighted to hear from Mr. Bill Kerr. Good to see you, Bill.
Do it again?
No?
Oh, it might be near you, Commissioner. Or
At the main? There you go.
I guess you really didn't want to hear from me. There we are.
You know, we have a trap door.
The microphone can fall.
My name is Bill Kerr, and I've been serving on St. John's board for about 8 years. I have one more year, and that's the end of the term. I'm a fourth or fifth generation Floridian. I live in South Brevard County and do a lot of work in Indian River County. I have a degree in biology from Stetson University, and I've been a practicing biologist in this area of the world for 25 years. I've listened to y'all's discussion. I've listened to several speakers. The way I look at things is you have to base your decisions on the best science that is available. Now, there are plans. People make house plans. People make plans for subdivisions. People make plans for land acquisition. People make plans for conservation. People make all kinds of plans. I've never seen a plan that has not been changed. Now, there has to be rules and regulations to govern those changes. And I, speaking as one board member out of 9, will assure you that the district will use the best scientific data possible, making all the necessary GIS overlays to determine the conservation value of the properties to be exchanged. Additionally, as you all know as elected officials, it's your responsibility to spend your tax dollars as judiciously as possible. It would be erroneous for me to stand up here and say that
I am going to frivolously spend the tax dollars of the hard-earned public gives to the Water Management District. So, of course, financial considerations have to be given. You have to consider those ramifications, but you cannot ignore the scientific data which will tell you what you can and can't do on the pieces of property. There's enough data there to study. There's enough data there to look at that information. I've begun to look at that information, and I can promise you that the district will make as informed a decision on July as possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you begun to cull all that information together, that scientific information, and when will you have it complete?
I have begun collecting the maps that the district scientists have given me, and I'll have to defer to Robert as to when the collection of information will be complete.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. We do have a fairly detailed assessment which is prepared. It was going to be released earlier in this week. The last thing we're adding is the scrub jay issue that I mentioned earlier. We anticipate its release probably about next Monday. That's what we're working toward. So sometime next week it will be released. We'll be happy to get copies to each of you and obviously the other folks who have an interest in this project.
Okay, thank you.
I got a question I guess more for Mr. Collins. If the state and governments have the sovereign immunity cap of $200,000, how would a lawsuit here?
That's only in tort, or when it's alleged there's some negligent act, which conceivably leakage of the levy could be this, but governments can be sued for contract breaches for more. It really depends on how the suit would be styled or what the cause for the bringing the action would be. But yes, there is a liability. Sovereign immunity protects government entities, including the state and its subdivisions, from liability for over $100,000, $200,000 per a damage event. Whether there could be recurring claims based on flooding over a period of years may be another issue too.
Yeah. Okay.
There is some potential protection there, though, and if the judgment exceeds that amount, the parties who got the judgment can always go to the legislature for a claims bill to seek additional compensation.
Okay. I see the difference. I appreciate it.
Any other questions or comments? Will, is there anything a specific question that we need to ask that we have not asked of these gentlemen?
I'm not sure that there's a question, but there were a couple of slides that were put up that had to do with the appraisals and the statute that controls it. And it was suggested that there should be 2 appraisals that were current within 120 days. When the county obtains lands worth over $500,000, we're required to get 2 appraisals. The statute with respect to sale or exchange of governing board lands does not require 2 appraisals, only 1. And the requirement of the current appraisal within 120 days, obviously good policy. If your old appraisal is 2 years old, you might want to update it. But that appraisal requirement is particular to lands that are being sold by the district, and there's another section that deals with exchange of lands by the district where it's required that they equalize the values of the land somehow. So arguably they don't need 2 appraisals, and although I would think it would be a good idea to update a 2-year-old appraisal, the requirement that it be current within 120 days applies only to a sale and not to an exchange.
Thank you for that clarification. Anything else from anyone? From the public? Yes.
Okay, there's a microphone on either side.
Oh, okay.
You're already there.
Yeah, you're
Frank,
you're more than halfway, don't stop now.
and that's definitely your better side, so.
You like it, huh, Leslie? My name's Frank Wagle. I'm Vice President of the Friends of St. Sebastian River. I live in Ursuline Heights. That is in unincorporated Indian River County. Okay, I have a couple of quick comments, and I don't want to keep you here too long. This property at one time had been under consideration by the Lands Acquisition Committee, and the St. John's asked that we not go into it with them, that they would do it on their own. The second thing, Mr. Christensen always mentions that all these things are not done in the dark, that there are many public meetings. I'd like the commission or myself to ask Mr. Christensen, please formulate a list of these meetings, minutes of these meetings, where they were held, and who was in attendance. You had said that that had happened with the Fellsmere Farms properties. I reviewed the minutes of the St. John's for 5 years. Not one mention of it until it came to the governing board for acquisition. And it was only by luck that Dr. Gilmore, Dr. Baker, and myself were in attendance at that meeting for a different problem. And all of a sudden, here it is on the agenda. No one in the county knew about it, not one of the commissioners. This thing, he said, for 5 years, they've been working on it, and there have been numerous meetings. Let's find out what they were. Let's find out if any commissioners were there. I'd really be interested in that. Second thing, I guess that's the third thing now. Okay. You got to put up with me. You know, it's a tough thing to follow these glib speakers, you know. I've been a volunteer at the St. Sebastian Buffer Preserve State Park, which is the correct title, for about 12 years. I've talked to all the managers about the corridor that goes down Route 95, and they said that was one of the most important things for them, to have a wildlife corridor that would connect up with the St. John's Water Management District's land to the south and west. Okay? Now this is going to be gone. Okay? The dreams of, you know, the preserve out there is slowly being eroded away. Last item I have is state statutes allow for annexing government bodies to have the voters within that municipality vote on whether they want properties to be annexed or not. And this is basically to protect small communities from the whims of just a few people. If you have a small community, there's no problem for the whole community to vote on annexing properties. And I'd like to encourage you to talk to the Fellsmere people about this. Before I came here, I lived in a similar situation. Okay, we're about 60 miles from New York City, 60 miles from Philadelphia. That's as the crow flies. Okay, and the citizens there did not want growth, and they stopped it simply by amending their ordinances to require larger properties. Okay, but the people did it. It wasn't just a couple of councilmen or a city manager.
that decided, yeah, we've got to annex with a couple of, landowners. Hey, thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else from the public? Okay, we do appreciate everyone's attention to this matter, and we will take it all under consideration and look forward to the scientific information you're going to send. We did add something to the agenda from our meeting yesterday, and we thank the Water Management for staying and addressing this. This is the Citrus Springs homeowners, and if anyone from the Citrus Springs homeowners would like to express your situation or problem, please come to the mic.
I'm Lou April from Villas of Citrus Springs. Yesterday we presented some of our problems, and I do have a couple of questions that we need resolved with St. John's Water Management. When you sign off on a plot, maybe I need an education first, and before that development is turned over to the homeowners, who signs off on that plot? Does St. John's Water Management have to sign off also?
No.
Besides the county?
No.
They don't. So if there's any issues with St. John's Water Management, that never comes up at the turnover to the homeowners. In other words, the homeowners would never know about it.
Well, there's a whole series of permitting involved in the development of land. What a final plat does is really create the parcels that are being sold, establish maintenance responsibilities, but there's a whole another layer of regulatory permitting that must be gone through, including St. John's.
If we're about to have a turnover and the county signs off and St. John's Water Management still has problems, how do the homeowners know about that?
Well, the county doesn't sign off on turnover.
Don't they have to sign over prior to turnover?
No.
No.
No, they sign off on your subdivision certificate of completion of the subdivision, and one of the permits required for that is St. John's.
That's what I'm referring to.
Okay.
Does St. John's have to sign on
Not the turnover from homeowner to development. It's when you get the certification of occupancy for your development, we check for a stormwater permit from St. John's.
So they have to sign off on it. So if they have not signed off on it, can you still turn it over?
When you say can you,
can the developer turn it over to the homeowners?
Yes.
And how does the homeowners know there's an issue?
Because when you buy property, there are recorded documents, deed restrictions and covenants that say when turnover occurs, and usually it will be when a certain number of the lots are no longer controlled by the developer. The homeowners have a right to control the majority of the homeowners board. But when that happens, how many lots have to be owned by homeowners is completely dependent on the deed restrictions that are filed before any lots are sold.
Let me go to specific issues that we talked about yesterday. We discussed on Fish Street Southwest, there are several homes in Key Line Cove that face Fish Street Southwest, and they have a flooding problem behind the houses that has not been resolved by St. John's Water Management. How does this problem get resolved?
Well, I'm going to have to rely on the engineers here a little bit, but my understanding is that whenever there's stormwater management issues that require a St. John's permit, they issue a permit and they have conditions not only for the development of the stormwater system, but for the operation of it. And the conditions of the permit are typically lengthy, and I think they have certain time frames to comply with operation and maintenance. The enforcement by St. John's, I think they would have to address. I'm not really in a position to say how they enforce it.
I'm still lost at how does anybody know when they do a turnover that these are open issues that have to be resolved? You haven't convinced me that there's information given.
Well,
I'm not a magician.
The developer is supposed to give you all deeds, contracts, outstanding permits. It's supposed to, any insurance policies, any warranties, the developer is supposed to provide those to the association.
Mr. Collins,
we don't have
them.
Me. No, I'm not kidding you. It's
You've
in the
been at
state
any of these
law.
turnovers? Have you been at any of these where they have a closing? They don't turn any of that information over.
then you have
There's a whole audience of people that can
then you
verify
have a
that.
cause of action against the developer.
Yeah, it's a civil matter against the developer. I think what you're getting confused is two things. One is when you get well, go over it again. The turnover of a homeowners association from the developer to a homeowners association has nothing to do with the county. Nothing. That's where I think that's a civil matter. It's got a
I understand
statute.
according to Florida statutes,
The county is
720
not named. Am I correct?
I disagree with you. According to Florida statute 720, there's a whole, on 72307, there's a whole list of things that have to be done. Besides, they have to meet all the county requirements that have to be done before that turnover. Something's missing here.
Somebody respond.
Well, typically, all the county requirements are complied with long before turnover, because the county requirements for roads, for drainage, landscaping, whatever they may be, have to be complied with. It used to be within a year of final plat. It still is. And the final plat is when lots start to be sold. Typically, all those improvements are complete. The county signs off within 1 year of the plat being approved, and several years down the road, the association turns over the common areas to the association. But if there's something askew after the 1 year, well, it used to be 1 year warranty period for public improvements. Now we've extended it to 3 years for public and private improvements. And what that means to you is half your plats don't have any security, and half of them are, since the more recent bonding requirements or warranty requirements. But our sign-offs come years before turnover.
Well, Mr. Collins, I'm totally confused. They're getting ready to turn over 7 villages. There are lakes, and I have pictures of them to show them. And I know that Jim Davis said they were graded. I'd like to see the certification that they were graded, that they have the 1 to 4 slope. I have pictures with me. I can show you. They're straight cliffs. It's amazing how you can have a straight cliff and say, well, due to water erosion, that's how you got those cliffs.
Well, when we're
Somebody's got to be saying that we've had a lot of rain the last year that caused all this.
If the development isn't consistent with the approved plans, that's something for the engineers, either with our county departments or St. John's, to be looking at, and it's not really as much a legal issue, so I'll have to let Mr. Davis respond.
Then you should be able to show us the certifications that an engineer surveyed this lake, it met the requirements, not somebody walked up to the lake and said, yeah, that looks pretty good. I want to know, where is the certified engineer who surveyed that lake and said it's a 1 to 4 slope?
They're on the as-built drawings. It's certified on the as-built
And
drawings.
you provide that information to us?
Sure.
Sure.
That's easy.
So what you're saying is that you can, I understand that it's written out and it's engineered. And I think what they're asking is that the person that went out and inspected it said, yes, this lake looks like what was written out and engineered and permitted.
Because if that's the case, that
right,
means
Luke?
the engineer is liable for certifying something that's not there.
No, he's not. I mean, the county inspector is not liable.
The engineer is who certified it.
Possibly.
Well,
Mr. Davis, do you have anything to
Yes,
respond
ma'am.
to this?
I think I can clear up the procedural aspects of it. Prior to the county even issuing a land development permit for a subdivision to be built, the developer's engineer applies for a St. Johns River Water Management District permit. We do not issue our land development permit until St. John's issues their stormwater permit, or it's usually called an environmental resource permit. As the subdivision gets built, the engineer of record, who is hired by the developer, is to provide on-site inspection of the project, and our inspector does cursory inspections at certain points of the construction. When the subdivision is finished, the engineer of record sends a form to St. Johns River Water Management District, basically certifying that the project was built in accordance with their permit and the approved plans. When we get notice that that certification's been sent to St. John's, We get a copy of that, and we go out and inspect the lakes and the roads, and we issue a certificate of completion after the punch list items are complete. So there is two certifications, one by the engineer of record that he sends to St. John's. He also sends a certification to the county, and then we issue our certificate of completion. And we do have some photos that were taken just today, I believe, as well as a history of the inspection of Lake E. That's the one we kind of zeroed in on since yesterday's meeting because we understood in yesterday's meeting.
It's Village F that has the bigger problem.
Well, I think there was quite a bit of discussion yesterday on Lake E.
Also, yes.
So we did send someone out today, and we've taken pictures, which we have on the computer. We can show you that there are 4-to-1 slopes there. The slopes are sodded. That's basically from the conservation water level to the high water level of the lake, and we didn't go down into the water, but we can show you those photos. You have them on the computer.
So, Jim, are you saying that there is no issue with the lake?
I have photos here that can show there is no 4-to-1 slope.
Here we go.
They are not graded.
Here we go. You're going to put those up. I'd like, one thing is you've got to remember some of these subdivisions were also released in 2003. We're sitting in 2007. After they're released, it's the responsibility of the development to keep up the stormwater area, keep it mowed. It's a private area.
I'm with you on that. And if they don't, then who does?
I think, and I don't want to answer for St. John's, and I think that's where the problem is. And
that's what I'm trying to give them some answer to. And I appreciate, you're right, Joe. You're right. I understand the logic, but they're after some kind of remedy here for a situation that nobody can help get them the answer to. And I think that's kind of our responsibility if we can.
Civil court is their area. That's what we keep we cannot.
You know, and I appreciate that. But we just had a workshop here a minute ago that basically said we're going to make a decision to keep us out of court. And here we are now trying to tell them that you need to go to court to get the decision. And it's a different matter, don't get me wrong, but it's still the same philosophy. There's a way of keeping them out of court and helping them get the decisions made. I think as a commission we ought to try to do that. But I mean, we can't be God either and force something that can't be forced. But I think that to give them some direction as far as if it's not maintained and we know somebody should be maintaining it, and if there's a permit that's issued by a governing organization and it's not being followed properly, where is the teeth for the residents or for this community to be able to enforce that?
I think Jim Davis is going to have to answer that, and St. John's.
If I could just interject. But one point, there's two components here. One, is there a deviation from the permit? And we're hearing our engineers say they looked at it today and the 4-to-1 slopes there. This gentleman saying they're not there. So that's a factual dispute in the first place. I'm sorry, go ahead.
All right. No, the real issue as I see it now is really not going to help us very much at Citrus Springs. I'm Fitzpatrick, the president. But it could help people in the future, more developments, and we've got a host of them out here. You're asking, by your rules that you guys didn't set up, but it was set up before, that the developer maintain the lakes and et cetera until he turns it over. And you're saying, well, the association's responsible. Well, the developer is the association at that point. So you're asking the fox to guard the hen house. And he's doing nothing. Now, this is not true of all developers, but I believe that you people need to enact legislation, statutes, whatever you call them, to protect the developments from this. You need to get your staff to inspect on a regular basis until it's turned over, to make sure that these things are done correctly. And I think that's your responsibility. And it should be the responsibility of the county. It should be St. John's responsibility also to be checking to make sure that their stormwater system is okay. And this should happen all the way to turnover. You're dealing with a lot of people who don't know what these problems are, have no idea in the world. Many of them are first-time home buyers. Most of them have not lived in a gated community. They don't understand these issues. And it's your responsibility to make sure that we have legislation, et cetera, to protect them.
And we do have, and we have made some changes, and that goes back to what has been said.
Yes.
You can't, the mechanisms that we have in place to protect the homeowners today in this situation is the bonds are extended to 3 years.
Right.
And it used to be, if it was a public road, it had a longer period of time than a private road. You may have a private road in your gated community. Therefore, you're now falling into the same pleasures that the local government was able to enjoy as far as those increased requirements. So really what has happened now will not be as readily able to happen again. Unfortunately, this was only enacted about 2 years ago,
right.
And so we haven't really had the opportunity to see if we have a foolproof mechanism. But we have done exactly what you suggested,
Right.
and I just hope that it's enough, but we haven't had the chance to test
I would
it.
hope that you would extend the bonds for until the community is turned over.
Well,
not just 3 years.
Actually, afterwards. I mean,
Well,
it's many of the date that the community's turned over is dictated by the covenants as the absorption of the community. So, but that 3-year period, it supersedes anything as far as if it gets turned over in one day.
Yeah.
You still have the 3 years to enjoy the protection of the bond that developers got to put forth to maintain the infrastructure and make sure that it's done appropriately. Gives you a couple opportunities to have rain and see if the pipes wash out.
Yeah, I understand that, except that now that housing the demand has lessened, it's taking longer to sell houses. We have an oversupply as it is. These communities are not going to be built out in 3 years.
3 years, and
And we need to go beyond that point. We need to go to the end, to the turnover. The bond should be there. It's the only whip you got, is the bond.
Right. Since we've encouraged St. John's to stay a little longer,
Right.
Anyone from St. John's like to come up to the mic, please, and address this dilemma? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm Mike Slayton with St. John's River Water Management District. In this situation, the St. John's doesn't have any performance bond requirements on this project because there were no wetlands involved in it. The performance bonds are construction bonds that are flow through the county, between the county and the developer. We've had a number of compliance issues with this developer with Suntree. The one outstanding issue that I'm aware of involves drainage problems behind about 5 or 6 homes that the gentleman just described. We're awaiting design plans to provide the drainage to remedy that situation, and the developer cannot transfer the St. John's permits without St. John's permission. I mean, they can make a request, and I will commit to you today and to the residents today that we will not transfer that permit from the developer to the homeowners association until they're in full compliance with our permit. The issue on lake slopes, as far as our requirements go, and I think Mr. Davis started to respond to this, is the slope requirement is really for the upper face of that slope, and when the water level recedes in an extreme drought, we don't have slope requirements for that. The purpose of the drainage system is to collect water from the lots and from the roads and make those passable and convey that to the stormwater collection for storage, treatment, and then ultimate discharge. The side slopes are a safety issue from normal water levels, and when you drop down into a drought, we don't regulate the side slopes below that level. But I will commit to you that we are going to resolve the issue where there was actually a conflict between the drainage requirements of St. John's and the county's requirements for a landscape and sound berm. And you can't put the two of them on top of each other. So the developer is slowly, but I hope surely, coming in with a design fix to remedy that situation between those 5 or 6 houses.
So you're saying as a result of your findings that the developer is fully financially responsible for the address to this issue, and that it will not be a burden on the citizens of that community?
Yes.
Like, what teeth does St. John's have to enforce that? Because at this turnover, generally 90% or more of the lots have been sold, the builders have built houses, people have moved in, and at that point, the developer may say, well, I'll just eat the last couple lots, I don't care if I get a permit or not, I've got most of my money, and I'm going to fold up this LLC next week and leave everybody holding the bag. What teeth does St. John's have to enforce those permits if you don't, if you're not requiring a performance bond on these kind of projects?
Again, the performance bond is typically required in the case where there's wetland impacts in regards to mitigation for those wetland impacts. On a straight construction project, that performance bond flows through you. So that would be your responsibility.
It'd be our responsibility to.
Yeah.
Excuse me for interrupting.
No, come.
I shouldn't probably do this, but I'm going to.
Well, go ahead.
Part of my business is to work with developers and about wetlands issues, but the St. Johns River Water Management District has a permit. That permit is written to whomever developer this is. Until the violations or conflicts or the things that are wrong with the permit according to the plans at St. John's will not allow that developer to turn the association over to the homeowners without remedying all those fixes. One of those is this drainage issue that I don't know anything about. So the leverage that St. John's has is they don't allow the developer to turn over to the homeowners association the permit without having all the limiting conditions and all the violations rectified before that turnover occurs.
But I think Commissioner O'Brien had a, and I didn't mean to dodge your question. What's to preclude the developer from going belly up and saying bankruptcy?
Yeah, and if it's an LLC, they close it up and open, Part 2 LLC.
Nothing.
Yeah, that's.
Except the next time they come in for a permit, odds are we'll be the same ones issuing the permit, and we're not going to facilitate permitting future projects with developers. We're going to make sure that we get additional sureties for their performance. You can burn your bridges once in this business. If you want to move to Alabama or wherever, that's a great strategy. But if you plan on staying in this building market, we're the permitter in town. And you'll be dealing with this again. And whether it's out of our office in Palm Bay or Altamont Springs or Jacksonville or Palatka. So in your permitting division, you do have a red flag system that will, when an applicant comes in, there's a match with a... Yes, sir. We have a centralized compliance system, and just by coincidence, that central director of that compliance group is housed in Palm Bay. Is this a developer? Okay. So, well, I'm certainly hope you guys have long memories. And yes, sir.
And if I could, so what Mr. Kerr just said then is, it sounds like to me that unless they're in compliance with that St. John's permit, and perhaps the appropriate thing to do is we think it's not in compliance, but what we need to be assured of is that the St. John's thinks it's not in compliance.
We think it is not in compliance in the situation where these 5 or 6 homes are located, where the drainage problem still needs to be corrected.
I thought that had already been turned over.
The permit has not been turned over.
Okay, all right.
The developer is still legally and financially responsible for correcting that situation.
Okay.
So then their HOA is not empowered at this time for any of the lakefront property?
Their HOA is not responsible to the St. John's for fixing the drainage problem behind the 5 or 6 homes. The aesthetic issue of the lake level and the slope below the toe of the slope where the ordinary water is an aesthetic issue that is between the homeowners and the developers. I've got nothing to do with it.
And that makes sense.
Right.
I mean, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
In other words, the average height of the water, you will hold them accountable for that sloping.
That landward.
That's the 4-to-1 right there.
And
that's what they meant.
none of that upland area has been released to the HOA?
June 25th.
The permit responsibility for maintaining that, we still retain as a covenant between us and the developer. If there are aesthetic issues between the residents and the developer, I'm out of that. If the residents of the homeowners association, the president and leadership of the homeowners association would like to, we'd be glad to meet with them on site tomorrow or as soon as is convenient to them and go over any outstanding issues that they believe they have. If there are issues that are within our domain of responsibility, we'll address them. If they're not, we'll inform them of that.
And I think that would be, and I might add to that if I could, maybe we could ask the county administrator to send somebody from community development on our permitting side, and then somebody from public works or engineering, from those two departments to be able to get everybody looking in each other's eyes instead of giving.
Sure. In fact, we were out there this morning because we were concerned, with all the complaints. We were concerned, and that's why we wanted to show you where the water line, normal water line is. We measured and it did meet the grade just like the requirements.
And I understand that.
Now, should it have been maintained as well? It's not being maintained as well as it should be.
Well, if it was just an issue of somebody going in there mowing that, we wouldn't have everybody.
Yeah, we'll be glad.
It's
In fact, we'll make sure that they meet out there and look at it all. We already were out there today.
I have a question. My name is Peggy Hoffman. I'm with the Villas of Citrus Springs. I'm wondering from St. John's, is there a singular permit that is applicable to all 7 of the villages? Is there a singular permit that is applicable to each of the 7 villages, or does each of the 7 villages hold a separate permit with St. John's?
My understanding is that there's an umbrella permit that addresses them all.
Okay, so the developer, as we speak, is responsible to St. John's until such time as you sign off on that permit, that you are satisfied with the job that they have done.
That the project is in compliance with those requirements, yes.
That's what I wanted to know.
Thank you, Mike.
This diagram shows the slope of Lake Tangelo on Villa G. That part of it does meet it. What doesn't meet it is the ones, this is a diagram. This is where the photograph was taken along here. The slope along this line here does not meet that 4-to-1 slope. Around where the houses are here, it does. Opposite, it does not.
Is that F? Is that considered F?
Part of E.
Part of E, okay.
This is right off Citrus Boulevard, and some of those places is a straight drop. The argument would be used, oh, this was due to erosion. The lake never got full. How could it be due to erosion? This is the highest the lake has been for many, many months. The lake level has not been gone down because St. John's Water Management, whoever manages the water, has not drained the canals. If you look at all the canals, they've been very high. The lakes are very high. They have not been drained. So you can't say that erosion is because the lake was high and then it went down low. We haven't had rain for a very, very long time. It has nothing to do with the higher and lower of the lakes.
Why don't we meet with you?
Graded. If you walk along here, you can't walk because it's a straight drop.
Why don't we meet with you, but high and raising and lowering is not the only reason for erosion, and I don't want to argue with it, but why don't we meet with you, look at it with St. John's? I think that'll solve it. I think also what we didn't know, because we don't know anything about what St. John does, but they might help you stop the turnover if they have to issue the...
Yes.
And see, we are not in that game. But one thing we do want to tell you, I think the commission wants us to go to the state and get more bite in that law. Work and lobby hard, and we will be doing that.
And I did speak with the our state representative, Ralph Popple. That's why I got up in the middle of the meeting real quick, and it doesn't appear they'll be able to do that in the special session. Unfortunately, the governor's tried to put 2 things in the special session, and the House leadership has said no, they're just going to focus on taxation, and that's all. So if the governor couldn't do it, I doubt very seriously we'd be able to.
Joe?
No, you go first. Joseph Paladin. One of the things that you need to be, I'm sure we're aware of, but maybe a lot of people aren't aware of. You know, developers aren't licensed. You know, a developer can be anybody. I mean, it can be somebody that actually does developing, like myself, or it can be a businessman that wants to invest in land and develop land. So that's the first thing. The second thing, yesterday, when Mr. Davis spoke about, you know, when an inspector from the county goes out and looks at the lake, if it looks all right, the whole thing, I think that there's a little misunderstanding there. It's not the county's responsibility to make sure that those lakes are graded to that particular 4-to-1 slope or whatever. It's their responsibility to review the paperwork, that when we do a development, we have our surveyor come out, and he does a survey at the beginning, he does a survey at the end before we turn over the, before we do the final plat, and when we do the as-builts, he has to survey it and certify it. And then the engineer has to certify it. So the engineer and the surveyor, the county, is just approving what the engineer and surveyor basically have certified. I mean, they've done the certification. They got the licenses. They come out and do the certification. When we get done with a subdivision, just take the lakes, for instance. Our surveyor will come out and he'll measure the depth of the lake. He'll measure the slope around the lake, and he'll resurvey it, and he'll certify it for the as-bills. And my engineer won't sign off on anything until all that's done and certify it. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. The county just doesn't, you know, walk through and look at it. But the county's responsible to make sure that all of those numbers add up to what the certifications are and to what the as-bills are. So there's a great deal of work that goes into that. So there's records that, you know, guarantee that. So it's not just a lackadaisical walkthrough by the county. It's quite an in-depth certification. So I just want to make that, you know, make that point clear. And the other thing was, when St. John says they wouldn't sign off on that, what about if it's done in phases? Would you sign off in phases if it's a phase project? Because, you know, we sign off in phases for...
No. In a situation where there's a single permit that covers the umbrella of a development, no, we would not sign off on it in phases. If there's a situation where a developer came in and had a conceptual permit over an area and then got individual construction permits from us, then we would sign off on those in phases. But in this situation, it's one master umbrella permit.
Okay, so even though it was phased out in 6 or 7 phases, as long as that developer had one phase left, you could go back and make it retroactive all the way back to the first phase that he had got approved. Is that what you're saying?
I believe so.
You sure?
I believe so.
Okay. No, I mean, that's good if you do. That's fine. But, you know, the county signed off in phases, so I thought maybe St. John's was signed
what is necessary to meet the drainage functional requirements of the permit may not cut it for a resident's aesthetic request. And when you have serious fluctuations in water levels, and I've dealt with this from Naples to Vero Beach over the years, when the water level drops down to the bottom, that's what happens.
Well, the end result of this meeting, as I understand, you're going to meet tomorrow, and you're going to get together and decide where and what time.
I provided the gentleman with the name and phone number. We're stand ready to meet.
We'll send somebody from the county.
Yeah, Jim, you're going to have someone meet, if not you, tomorrow with them. You'll be there at that time.
On those drainage problems, Joe, if you remember when we met with the people from Citrus over a year ago, or almost 2 years ago probably, and Lou, if you can remember, when we held the developer and told him about the drainage problems in back of those houses, didn't he say that the builder basically regraded the lots in a different way to where he changed the slope? So actually he drained everything from the front to the back instead of from the back of the house to the swale. Didn't we remember going through that at one time?
Yeah, I think St. John's is the one that, because the builder was blaming the developer,
Exactly.
But St. John's has the authority there, and that's what we were trying to get across to everyone yesterday. That's where St. John's has the hammer, not us, and that's what gets confusing. But I think tomorrow's meeting will help. Also, we'll try and get We will try and get you as-built that have the measurements of the lakes and are certified by a third-party engineer, and we'll get you copies of the as-built. I think that'll also give you comfort and help you.
Good luck.
Yeah, thank you.
Meeting adjourned.
Thank you.